what I like to talk about is how to divert food waste and eat your yard. So I presented a very similar presentation recently for the LSC Sustainability Summit, but I think it's something that composting and community garden really go hand in hand with each other. And so I kind of like to keep on this theme because repetition really drives things home. So I'll just give a brief outline. So I'm gonna introduce who we are, the Community Compost. What do we do? What do I do? Food waste, and where does it go? What else can we do with food waste? And then talk a little bit about edible yards, green spaces, and some other ideas that we can incorporate into our community to kind of, as the mission of the LSC is, to diminish our carbon footprint, our impact on our environment. So who are these crazy people who are doing all this composting? Who are just saying, turn your food in the dirt? Well, there's myself, Brian Barnes, and Josh Cagle, these are the two big pillars of our composting trio. We did just add another employee recently, but Josh is a student at the University of Louisville. He's been environmentally concerned. He's a sustainability aficionado, if you will. And he is a very big part of making sure that we get the buckets from people's homes to the compost pile. And then Brian, co-founder, co-owner of the community co-op, is a philosopher and environmentally conscientious individual who's been really driving this composting home with previous projects, Higher Grounds, I believe it was, with Heine Brothers. And then he started the University of Louisville Community Composting Project, which we work very closely with and compost at their site. And then there's me.
Sean, let me just say
that
was just breaking new grounds for people.
Breaking new grounds, that's right.
Yeah, some people might remember it from the old days, but thanks for the shout out, buddy.
I always get the names wrong. And then there's me, some weird graduate student who decided to start a composting program in Louisville at the chagrin of my wife and kids, who don't get to see me as much on Sundays, but sometimes they need that time away from me. But there are also about 170 residents around the city and several businesses who are participating in this composting service. And we couldn't be doing this without them and making the impact, as minor as it is relative to the number of people in Louisville, without them. So the start of this began when I moved from Maine to Kentucky and realized that there wasn't any composting buckets around the city. In Maine, they have two companies covering about an area 3 times the size of Louisville, of Jefferson County. And there are 2 companies, and there were none in Jefferson County. And this really surprised me. And so while I was working on my master's in pharmacology and toxicology at the University of Louisville, and I just transitioned to a PhD candidacy, I decided that, hey, I have all this free time outside of my research, and I should probably do some composting. So August 2018, I met briefly with Brian. We decided, hey, let's start off on this venture, and we started the Louisville Compost Co-op. And so we started collecting food waste in 5-gallon buckets, as seen here, with our model, who's my youngest stepson. And then we eventually worked up from driving 30 buckets in our cars each week to a nice van, which we now have our name on the side of, so you know who we are. And we started making some compost. So we have this bottom image, we have fresh compost, finishing compost, and then finished compost. And so, you know, we started all this, but before, you need to know why we want to do this. Why is composting important? So food waste each year is wasted, a lot of food waste is wasted each year. Approximately 360 million pounds of food waste, 78.8 billion pounds of food waste per year. That's from a population of roughly 330 to 360 million people, with an average family size of 3 people per family. That equates to approximately $183 billion in food waste. This is not even counting the food that goes to waste from shelves or that isn't picked on farms. This is just from residential food waste. Now, I don't know about you, but that seems like a lot of waste for middle class and lower middle class families and lower class families to have to be burdened with. So rather than having such a wasteful practice, I think, or I've thought, a number of people have thought, why not find a way to redeem this wasted food? And so what we found was that other people had this thought, such as the city of Louisville, and they did a report, I believe in 2016, I believe it was started, and it was completed in 2018 or 2013, and then they had a further consultant that concluded that the city really needed things such as the composting and other green activities in order to meet their sustainability targets. So as far as the amount of compost that we've produced, in about 2 years, so since October 2018, when we first started, we've produced over 24,000 pounds, which is 12 tons of food waste from residents alone. So we started out with about 40 residents, and now we're at 170. And so our food waste each week has grown pretty significantly. But that's about 8 pounds per week per household. And this does vary from family to family, but that's pretty significant when you think about the scale of that food waste that would have gone to landfill. And so from businesses, we've also collected about 5 tons in those 2 years. So that's about 2.5 tons average per year from businesses. And that's only from 3 businesses. So if you think of the number of businesses in Louisville and the impact that that would have on the amount of food waste that goes to landfill, again, it's astronomical, it's huge. And so, as I mentioned, we're only serving at present less than 0.02% of Louisville. And that's less than 0.01% of Louisville Metro. So if we had even 1% of that, we would have 100 times more food waste that we'd be diverting from landfill to produce soil, compost. And a lot of people like to see this right now as the amount of carbon dioxide that's diverted. And so roughly in those first 2 years, we diverted about 10,000 kilograms of CO2. And at 10% of Louisville, because I like to work with numbers, that'd be about 300 tons of food waste per year, which roughly equates to 517,000 kilograms of CO2. And 1 year of electricity in 126.5 households. This was done with a online CO2 calculator, so I have to go back and find some literature on it, but it's still quite an astounding start to consider the amount of food waste and impact this has on the environment. So why start composting? It's smelly, it attracts animals, no. So composting, why throw stuff away? Why throw food waste away when you can turn it into soil that you can use in your community garden, in your plants, around your house? So composting on your own, we are more than happy to help advise you. You can call us up, you can email us, info's on the website, LouisvilleCompost.com. There are other projects around the country that have been doing this. This has been a practice since the dawn of man. You could compost with us. We take care of it. We provide you a 5-gallon bucket. We pick it up weekly. We clean it. We return a clean bucket. You can get compost from us on request. It's only $20 a month. You could also go to some of your community gardens in your neighborhoods and ask them if they have a composting location on site, and you can compost with them. Or we can help you set up composting in your neighborhood. Excuse me. If you have a large enough number of people and an area that you can do it, then you're more than welcome to contact us, and we will help you set that up. We're very interested in making sure that we many people as possible in this practice. And I apologize if you all hear children shouting in the background. My kids are very done with NTI at this point. So what is this crazy idea of turning food into soil and soil into food? So composting is the natural breaking down of food waste. You're taking raw organic matter that are nitrogen, carbon containing, and these microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, are breaking them down and producing heat, CO2, and water. Now, someone asked earlier if composting produces methane. So to that point, there are two forms of composting. There's aerobic, which is oxygen dependent, and anaerobic, which is oxygen independent. And these involve two different families of bacterium and microorganisms. The aerobic are consuming oxygen. They are putting out CO2 and water in the form of water vapor as a result of the heat that they produce from breaking these carbon chains and nitrogens. And then the anaerobic are producing sulfur and methane containing compounds. This is what most people would think of when you hear of or think of smelly compost. So the difference between that is that, sorry, you need to get out of the camera. Had a guess there. So the major difference between these two is the byproduct, whether or not it contains methane or CO2 alone. So what happens when the food waste goes to landfill is that you get this organic matter that's breaking down anaerobically and creating pockets of methane that some landfill management groups will try and tap, almost as if it's natural gas pockets under the earth, because the same process happened naturally millions and millions of years ago, and it was capped when plants and animals died and created a natural gas pocket. Now, you can alternatively capture the methane, scrub it, and use it as a natural gas source. It does require a monetary input to put the infrastructure in place, but there are communities around the world who actually do this as a heating and cooking fuel source. And it is something that I'd be interested in investigating further as an alternative energy source rather than burning fossil fuels or coal that we're having to extract, because this would be more close to a carbon neutral, though not quite 100% carbon neutral. It would be a cleaner carbon. So we're taking from, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, but just before you go forward, I just want to say one thing to anybody who's watching this, and you're doing a wonderful job, by the way. Let me just say that, partner. But I want to suggest to everyone that you really don't have a lot of options. This is what Louisville Metro doesn't understand. And unlike Sean, I mean, I was born and raised here, and I've lived elsewhere, but I do have a sort of a hometown perspective. We don't understand this as a local culture at all. The options are you throw it in the landfill, it makes a lot of methane, and the landfills eventually fill up, so we have to go beyond them, right? Which no one wants to do. And there are lots of other problems with landfills, even though they're necessary. So that's one thing we can do with our food waste, throw it in the landfill. No good. That's what we do now, friends. We throw it in the landfill. We could let it digest just hanging out anaerobically. This is the problem that Sean just pointed to. Creates a lot of methane, anaerobic digestion of food waste. It happens in the landfill. It will also happen if you just leave a pile of the stuff laying around. It's what happens to our leaves when we just leave them out there, right? 3 years or something, it turns into soil. This is the process we've all been watching all of our lives if you grew up around here. I mean, this happens. That also produces methane, which is probably 20 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, even though it doesn't persist as long in the atmosphere. You don't have to produce any methane. You can compost aerobically, which is what Sean is suggesting and what we're trying to promote here in Louisville for the benefit of everyone. And that's all I had to say. Just wanted to add that, clarify.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Brian. Yeah, so both of these are natural processes. It's that difference between a sedentary versus a relatively active detritus breaking down. And so what we're doing is we're using this natural process, and we're taking that food waste and diverting it from these landfills where you could get methane pockets that are just aberrantly producing methane and sulfur-containing compounds, and we're turning it into nice, beautiful compost. So on the left here, you can see a lot of the food waste from our residents. This was taken over the summer. And then in the middle, we have a representative compost pile and our happy microorganisms. And then on the right, we have our finished compost. So this is compost that we produce year round. We'll be out there every Sunday, 12 to 2. I can provide the address to people who are interested showing up and volunteering. This is the U of L Community Compost projects aspect of it. So volunteers are always welcome. We're there practically every Sunday. I'm not allowed to be there on Christmas or Easter, but maybe the day after.
I am.
Brian, his partner lets him. My wife gets upset if I skip out on church.
Someone's out there though, for sure, even if Sean's at church.
Absolutely. So it's just moving forward into how do we get from these red buckets full of food waste to our compost. You know, do they just magically appear? No, what we do in a very simplified, cartoonish description is we get your address when you sign up. We take our red buckets. We are considering other colors to distinguish ourselves, but I think red for Louisville is pretty stand out. And we collect them as shown before in these 5-gallon buckets, which have a nice sealable lid to keep animals out, keep any smells out. Because when it's sitting there for a week, it does start to break down because it's all these bacteria and microorganisms that are in our environment that are contributing to creating this compost. And then we turn the pile weekly to work in that oxygen, keep it aerobic, and produce nice, beautiful compost. So what we offer is a service of for $20 a month. We provide a 5-gallon bucket. We collect the bucket. We turn the food waste into compost, clean the bucket, and then on request, we will deliver compost in relatively small quantities, 20 to 30 pounds, to individuals around the city and greater Louisville metro. And as you can see, it's just beautiful compost. It's wonderful. I put it in as many of my wife's house plants as she'll let me. And we use it around the facility. Other people around the community, including the botanical garden, have used it. Everybody loves it. And so, yes, Brian?
May I add, please? We give this stuff away to folks in the community. You know, we're part of our business here at the Louisville Compost Co-op is not selling the compost. We sell the labor. We got to bring it to you. We might charge you something, but if you want to come out and get a car full of compost, a truckload full of compost, then come get it. It's for the community. That's U of L's mission, and the Compost Co-op is merging with that because most of us aren't going to come out to the compost site, but as we've been pointing out, composting is still needed. So just come out and get some compost and also learn how. As Sean mentioned, we're happy for you to replicate it in your own yard.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian. And so I just want to let people know a little bit more about who we partner with outside of this is an older graphic, 170 plus residents in the greater Louisville metro. We're also working with elementary schools such as Bloom, which is where my kids go, so it's no coincidence. That's Ronan. So we work with their Food is Elementary program where they teach first graders a little bit about cooking in different cultures and make sure that their food waste is going to, rather than the landfill, going to a good use. And I'll show a little bit more about what good use that is at Bloom. We also have been partnering and donating our service to Backside Learning at Churchill Downs. They provide a lot of educational and food security to employees at the backside of Louisville, or the backside of Churchill Downs, excuse me. We've also been in talks and donated compost to Waterfront Botanical Gardens, which I recommend everyone goes to in the spring and summer. It's beautiful. It's a great venture that's going on. We've also partnered with Angels Envy. They've been composting with us now for over a year and a half, I believe, as well as Payne Street Bakehouse, who, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, actually stopped composting with us, but I still recommend them. Their bagels are phenomenal. And so where does our compost go? So as I mentioned, Bloom Elementary has been giving us their food waste from the Food is Elementary program, and they've been taking and turning it into beautiful vegetables in their garden out front of the school. And a lot of that this last spring they sent to Feed the West, which is another wonderful program started by Chantrice Martins. I hope I got her name right. She is a brilliant young woman who has been doing a lot of great work. And if you have an opportunity to follow the Black Market, I recommend it. They're doing some great work moving. Let me think of a great way to say this, of bringing back some rain to the food deserts of West Louisville. So she's been doing some brilliant work with that. And I totally encourage people to support Feed the West and similar urban agricultural programs. And then I just wanted to bring up that there are a number of other cities around the nation that have been doing this. And it's also a worldwide natural phenomenon that cities in Europe, Asia, India compost. They don't just throw their food waste into landfill, they compost. I mean, look, you have larger cities than us that are doing this, but we don't need to be defined by the size of our city to make a decision to do something that is environmentally right or that is sustainably proper. We need to do this because we know it's the right thing to do, and it makes the most sense. Why just throw food away? You paid for it, you might as well get the most out of it that you can, so you might as well produce some soil with it. So that's kind of my pitch on compost. Now I want to talk about something that is like, I don't want to say blue sky dream, but this is something that is totally possible to do in our yards in Louisville, around the country. And that's edible yards. So this is permaculture, this is urban ag, this is trying to make as much good food available to yourself and your community as possible. And this is very easy to do by converting our traditional Western European, sorry, get my directions confused, Western European ideals of a yard. Rather than having just a grass yard, you can incorporate food producing plants, fruiting plants, vegetables into this space that you do not have to utilize fertilizer because you can use compost. You don't have to use pesticides because you have plant combinations that help maintain and take care of each other, that encourage animals that will take care of these pests, such as mice and such. And it's a more natural habitat. Food. So I like to eventually work in my long rambling conversations into changing their lawns, rethinking their lawns and gardens. Rather than having a grass lawn, if you don't want to have plants, why not convert to moss or clover? You don't have to mow it as often, so you're not burning any fossil fuels. You don't have to worry about it growing super long because moss and clover are very, they don't have a tall stature compared to grass. Grass will just keep growing and growing, but moss and clover don't. They require less water.
They just spread.
As my son just said, they just spread. And they act as a very efficient carbon dioxide sink. So these greens that do not need to be cut, don't require a lot of water, they hold a huge amount of CO2. And as I said, you could also make your entire lawn a permaculture garden. There are also several projects around the country similar to a project called Yard Yum that involve converting individuals' front yards into gardens. And I encourage people to look into Yard Yum. We are considering a similar project. And so what they do is they rent your yard space from you and convert it into a garden. So I hope people I'd like to hear if people want to have something like this happen in their neighborhoods or at their homes, because I really want to see this get started. And I could probably ramble on that for a few hours, but I'm going to progress. So am I nuts? Is anyone else doing this around the globe, around the country? There are plenty of people who are doing these things. There are tons and tons of urban agriculture programs that are benefiting communities around the nation, around the globe. And I really think that Louisville is a beautiful place that needs this to happen. Not only is it, finding open lots, but it's finding spaces that we don't traditionally think of as garden spaces. So like rooftop spaces, underutilized parking lots, underutilized aquaponic opportunities, such as growing food on floating platforms on the side of the river or on ponds and lakes that are underutilized or that might not be safe for fishing and swimming. So toxic ponds can be cleaned through plants. You can use these to kind of scrub to ameliorate the effects of open top mining and stuff like that. So these are great alternative options that I think we should, as a community, come together and say, hey, why don't we try this? And so what else can we do? I've talked about composting, gardening in our community, urban ag, greening our spaces, but we can also change some of our ideals, some of our transportation. We can bike more. I try to, but sometimes it gets cold, and I'm from the Northeast, but it still gets a little too cold for me to bike. But if you've ever been to Europe, you've gone to Amsterdam, there are more people biking than there are driving through the cities. And I think Louisville is a beautiful city that doesn't need to have as much in the way of traffic jams as it does. When it's safe to do it again, public transportation. I would like to see more to harp on these things, but these are just, composting is kind of like a beginning of opportunities, an upside down pyramid, if you will, of things that we can do to better our community. Or you could say it's a compost pile of things that we could do, because it does form a nice pyramid. There are alternative energy ideas. Like I mentioned earlier, with the methane from food waste, you can make biogas, bioethanol, biodiesel. These are just some fun things, because as a scientist, I like to think about these crazy ideas and chew Brian's ear off every weekend about this next week's idea. More solar and stock. Additionally, support other local green events and businesses. Louisville Sustainability Council, of course. This is my other son and our cat. Anytime there's a video on, all the kids love to jump in. So they all say hello. And so I guess with that, hopefully I've satisfied everybody, and I will try and answer some of these questions that have come up.
I'll answer a few of them, Sean.
Brian, go for it.
Oh, well, I think I've answered a few. I just want to point out to everybody, you did a wonderful job, in my opinion, by the way. Let me just point out to everyone that sustainable systems, sometimes they require a little bit of planning and a little bit of infrastructure, but we can help you at U of L. I lead a number of sustainability initiatives at U of L. There are yet others that are beyond me. We have a large infrastructure at the university, and we can help you plan for ways to become more sustainable, and we can help you understand even what that means. And our partnership with the Louisville Compost Co-op is just part of that, but we're totally open. So if you have ideas about how to make your space greener, contact us. It may not cost you very much. It may be the sort of thing where we can do it for the greater good or something like that. I just want to point out that even though Sean and I are doing something here that is trying, I mean, obviously we charge $20 a month and all that. We really are trying to improve sustainability infrastructure across Metro, whatever that looks like. And we want to have conversations about that, and we want to contribute anywhere that we can, because there is, as he pointed out, there is literally so much that could be done. We are really in an area of opportunity here in Louisville, and I would love to see more sustainability stuff happen, just as people are interested in it. So please reach out to any of us. And I'll step back now. I could talk about this like him for a really long time. So.
Some Sundays we just ramble, and the compost doesn't get turned until 3 o'clock, and it's not good.
When does the work get done sometimes? Anyway, thank you for having us, by the way. I know I kind of trashed it, and I do.
I appreciate that. I appreciate it, Brian. I saw Diane Clem. Did I remember that right? Did you raise your hand and have a question?
I didn't have a question. I'm just trying to get back on the screen. It told me I was driving and turned me off.
We're glad you're here, Diane.
Thank you. But one of the pictures you showed with the raised boxes, my neighbor upstairs and I've been putting this milk cartons boxes lined with that lawn cloth and added to our little garden that way. We put it on the driveway, but it's not very elegant. But
are you guys using compost?
Yes, we're just a mile from you all, so I've come by and gotten compost, and she has too. So.
Oh, cool. Come back again. We've got some cool things happening. Sean mentioned aquaponics. We're going to do some mycoculture.
In the big barn where the worms are?
Yeah, where the worms are, absolutely. And I didn't mention the vermicompost. So the U of L Community Compost Project, Brian also started vermicomposting, which is using worms to further break down the compost into this more refined super compost called vermicompost. And it's like compost on steroids, worm steroids. I don't know.
Well, and that's the thing, is that the vermicompost, I was responding to Nicholas's very kind and generous comment. Thank you, Nicholas. We miss offering food on Fridays. We're going to do it as soon as the pandemic allows us to get back to that. We'd love to have you and everyone join us in Metro for EcoReps workshops. We already do them virtually right now to educate about sustainability every Friday of the month, from noon to 1, and you can find out about that at University of Louisville Sustainability website. Sometimes we talk about the U of L Community Compost Co-op, or I'm sorry, the Louisville Community Compost Co-op, sometimes the vermiculture. But at any rate, just wanted to comment on that also. In terms of vermicompost, that is the best soil that nature creates. It's worm poop. We can teach you how to do it. Obviously, you can't do it. We teach you how to keep the
worm.
Keep the worms at your house, in your kitchen or your garage or whatever, and keep them alive and have them eating your food waste. We also teach you how to use that vermicompost, and we have some very fine employees helping us. Kyle's is another employee we have at U of L helping us with vermicompost. We can give you the stuff, we can give you the worms, we can give you the information, we can give you the setup, we can give you everything. So come join us. And thanks again, Nicholas. We will look forward to that.
So I have a quick question. If may I have a moment?
Yeah.
All yours.
So I wanted to rewind back to where you had noted moss lawns.
Mm-hmm.
I've actually been trying to do about 2 seasons. The house that I have originally, some of the previous owner, a large portion of the yard was actually just pea gravel. I guess they just did the cutting grass.
Yep.
And so slowly I'm taking bucket pea gravel out, but there's so much embedded in the grass or in the dirt that there's a really good spot to do moss. But my challenge is getting a massive amount of moss. Basically, what I've been doing is just taking small plugs from when I've been going on hikes. Please don't tell on me. But so I've been taking small plugs as I've been going on hikes and trying to transplant that, hoping it was going to spread. And I have like a couple of small patches of moss and that's about it. So I was wondering if you guys had any ideas. I've seen the moss milkshake. I don't know if that works.
So, yeah, I have seen moss
Do you
graffiti.
guys have any ideas?
I've seen moss graffiti, which I think would probably work really well. Kind of where you gently blend up some moss, mix into some soil, like compost or vermicompost would probably work best as a kind of a top. And then you just need to make sure that while that moss is setting, that you're keeping it nice and hydrated, because it's coming from its home to a harsh condition, and then you're setting it up, and it wants to succeed, and you want it to succeed, but you need to make sure that you're watering it and probably refreshing it a little bit every once in a while. But I think that should work. And with the rocks, I don't know about Kentucky soil, but I know in Maine, eventually they'll work out. They'll work up to the top if you have fine enough compost. Eventually, they'll work up to the top of the soil.
So, should I be putting compost down in the area that I've cleared before I put the moss down? Do you think? My soil is basically, I'm not too far from U of L, so that's what I'm dealing with.
It depends on what you're dealing with. It could be any kind of soil, unfortunately.
If it's really clayey, like if it seems to contain a lot of clay, like it's really hard packed or brown and dead, it would not be a bad idea to try and take a few extra inches off and throw down some compost or some other, or even just leaves, and cover the leaves with compost, because that'll give you a nice nutrient-rich detritus that'll break down, that'll provide support for the moss.
Another thing is too, just with regard to the moss varieties, overwhelmingly, they don't like direct sunlight. So that's going to be another factor with regard to that. If you're trying to do it in the middle of the lawn, I mean, good luck, right?
So cloves might be a better option.
I'm trying to put them under basically this section of the yard is under a dogwood.
Should be nice. I mean, should be nice. You might, one thing I would suggest, and a lot of people don't think about this, but I might suggest putting down a couple of succulent varieties. We've been doing that instead of moss at the composting site because we're trying to turn it into a butterfly pollinator garden and some other kinds of garden spaces there. We have a large site. And so I've found that succulents have done a nice job in sort of establishing themselves in relatively hostile and difficult environments, like in shady areas and in wet areas and in high traffic areas. I've just been really impressed with the succulents and their ability to thrive there. And I was thinking the other day that they might be a nice precursor to putting in some moss. So I don't know if that's actually a strategy, but it is one that I'm working on. And I would just suggest it for whatever it's worth, because it seems like for a lot of the succulents, particularly stuff like stone crop, it seems like the conditions are very similar to what you want for moss, and they produce beautiful stuff. And I don't think they really compete with moss so much. So anyway, just for whatever it's worth.
So
Thank you, guys.
you're very welcome. Barbara Berman, did you have a question?
I do. So if you're digging your compost, your food waste into your yard, doesn't that break down by a fair amount of worms? And I guess my question is, why is that producing methane, whereas the vermicomposting doesn't?
So Brian, I think, answered a similar question earlier. So the worms will only eat a certain amount. Brian knows the volume relative to their body weight what is it, like 100 times their body weight in a
Well, no,
certain
no. I
period?
mean, they'll eat their body weight in 24 hours. If you're using red wigglers, the major problem is the worm that you're using, I think. And when you're talking about methane, I mean, one issue is the material, as Sean points out, the material has to break down before the worms will eat it. And then as part of the worm process of creating worm shit, they will create methane. It's just part of it. It's very small, as I mentioned, but the combination of the anaerobic processes that go into the stuff rotting normally to the point where you could feed it to something like Escherichia fetida, which is the major worm we use for composting. It's often called the red wiggler. We also use it for fishing in this region. There'll be a small amount of compost made either way. In your garden, you're going to have a small amount of methane. But I mean, oh my gosh, for both of these processes, both vermicomposting and burying stuff in your yard, the amount of methane is relatively, I mean, it's orders of magnitude smaller than what you would get if you tried to compost the same amount of material. So I hope that begins to address your concern, Barbara.
I had another question about having a zero waste yard.
So go ahead.
Do you have any thoughts on how to do that?
Lots. I mean, it would take an hour for me. I don't know about Sean.
I will just start spewing off ideas. You could tear up your grass and start putting down start putting down various vegetative plants. You could put potatoes in your soil. You could put kale on your top of your soil, put down compost. You could designate an area in your yard to be your compost. You can plant fruit-bearing trees, which will provide shade and reduce any heat island effects and also give you some nice, delicious fruit.
Yeah, I don't have much yard. The problem is when you have waste from what is growing, I want it to all go back, and I don't have a shredder, which would help a lot, but I don't really want to get a shredder either.
I can help with that a little bit. I mean, if you don't want a shredder, but you recognize the value of shredding, one of the things that you can do is put that material inside of a cloth bag and you can stomp on it. Leaves or whatever. You could do it with a plastic bag as well, but I bet if you don't want to do this other stuff, you're probably not using a lot of plastic bags. So we can give you burlap sacks, or any coffee shop that does its own roasting can give you burlap sacks, and you can put yard waste into those burlap sacks and you can stomp on it and stand on it and put it right outside your door as a mat, and have everybody stand on it and just compress it and crush it and tear it up through that process. And then you can use it as a cover or as a fill for any, I mean, just a variety of yard projects that you're probably already aware of. You could also take that material and you could feed it to red wigglers, or even a portion of it, probably only 30%, unfortunately, but you could probably feed something like 30% of it to traditional earthworms and the rest of it to red wigglers. It would take a little bit of management in terms of things like moisture. It might be a little bit of a hassle, but you can certainly do that. You could also do, I mean, if you're talking about things like leaves and yard material, I mean, some of that stuff could even be turned into stuff like paper mache. I mean, if you just didn't want to just let it be wasted, you could turn that stuff into various media for art or even for building in something like a cob environment. So, I mean, nothing need be wasted. Keep in mind, everything that we would have taken to the landfill per se prior to 1800, no one took to the landfill. I mean, if this stuff was around prior to 1800, it got decomposed and it got reused and it got put back into the systems that we're all sort of aware of ecologically. And so, I mean, those opportunities are still available to us. Sometimes it takes a little bit of imagination. If you find that you're running out of ideas and you can't get a hold of us, I recommend the Louisville Permaculture Guild. They are awesome at creative ways to interact with the ecological systems. For whatever it's worth.
Yeah, because just like Brian just mentioned, people used to have kitchen gardens right outside their window, right outside their door that they would throw their food waste in.
Right.
I'm just going to shift to, so Nicholas Johnson asked a question. My compost pile is sitting on the ground in the backyard. Would it be good to put down an old piece of wood as a barrier underneath to keep it separate from the crummy soil? Or is it good to have the pile directly in contact with the dirt? So I would say don't put a barrier down. But that compost, that's going to revitalize that bad, crummy soil underneath. That's going to, any worms that come into the compost pile will start integrating into that crummy soil to try and, when the compost dries out, they'll work down into the soil.
Yeah.
And they'll loosen that up and they'll reintegrate some of those nutrients.
Right. And one thing you might, if I may also, one thing you might want to think about is once that stuff gets really wet, even if you have a bunch of clay soil trash, Nicholas, you're going to have earthworms show up. And that's almost seasonal, but certainly they will come around. The earthworms are going to probably operate in the first 4 to 6 inches of that soil, and they're going to get it started. It's not going to be good soil after earthworms really spend some time rolling around on it, but when it gets wet, if they're adjacent, they'll come in. If there's decomposing material on it, they'll come in just because that's what they want. But once it's gone, they won't be there. So you could attract them to the soil, the earthworms, attract them to the soil. And then once the top layer, the first 4 to 6 inches has been processed maybe after a year by earthworms with this material that they would like to eat, you could bring in red wigglers to go to the next 6 inches. And then you got some pretty cool soil. But I mean, 2 to 3 years if you want to do it old school. So, yeah. Sure, yeah. And thanks for showing. Good to see you. Good to see you. Mr.
Yeah. So LSC, does compost processing take longer in the winter? So that is a fun question. No, it takes exactly the same amount of time. So these compost piles, these bacteria, fungi, they're producing a lot of heat. In the summer, we get up to temperatures in the air, maybe 100 degrees. These compost piles year round are cooking between 135 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit.
That's right.
So that is consistent. That is a big part of turning piles and using these aerobic bacteria is this process. This is what helps us maintain our homeostasis, is this breaking down of sugars, of breaking carbons and nitrogens. This breaking bonds, these chemical bonds, produces a lot of heat. And when you do that on the millions and millions of the scale of millions and millions of times every few minutes,
right,
it produces a sustained temperature. And it's really fascinating. You go in December after a snowstorm and you'll see the snow melting off the compost pile, and you open it up and it's steaming and it's 150 degrees and you just want to lay down in it, but it smells a bit, so you don't.
Well, that's right. And Melissa's quite right. Her comment over here in the chat, you absolutely can use compost to heat a greenhouse or a hoop house in the winter, and we want to recommend everyone do that. You can grow crops year round in this region if you will heat your adjacent hot box space, whatever that looks like, with decomposing material. It has to be active, this compost. You can't just go to Frank Gotti and throw a few bags of dirt in there and go, I've got it. It needs to be breaking down because, as Sean points out, all of those processes produce heat, not only the reproduction, but also the excretion. So we've got bacterial sex and bacterial poop that are making all of this heat. And I mean, what could be more natural than that? So we really, everybody can avail themselves of these processes, and those glass panels and those 6 mil plastics, 4 mil plastics you've got there around your hoop house, those things will keep the heat in for the winter, so you can continue growing whatever you're into.
So Amelia asks, do we have any difficulty with members putting non-compostable items in the bins? We do. Probably
Forever.
forever. We will always have this issue. One of the biggest concerns that I have are these compostable plastics. So these are starch-based plastics that will break down at high sustained temperatures. So we do occasionally get the temperatures, but we aren't getting industrial composting processes like large farms, or there's a group out in Seattle. I can't remember what they're called. It's like Pine Tree Sustainability or something like that. But they're doing, they're composting on the order of metric tons a day. So that's, hundreds of thousands of pounds of food waste a day, because they're serving Seattle, Tacoma, and the greater Seattle area in Washington state. So those plastics require a high heat to help the bacteria break those bonds. Otherwise, those plastics just take way too long to break down in our process. But we do occasionally get other things that people throw in that are not traditionally compostable. Sometimes we try it out. We had a football in the pile for a while. We have forks and spoons. But when it comes to those metals, the process of the finishing process on those is actually not great, but it's not going to kill a whole compost pile. It's just not going to break down because it's metal, not organic. So we also got a question: is the site located on the U of L campus? Do you have to make an appointment to come by? So you don't have to make an appointment to come by. We're at 240 East Bloom Street. There's a sign that says no trespassing, or is that what it says, Brian?
That's what it says.
Something like that.
Sign.
Yeah, I got a different sign. Compost in the back is what it should say.
That's what it says.
But so we're there Sundays, 12 to 2, and you're welcome to come during that time.
Just
Just show up. Before that, after that, that's fine. During the week, because it is a U of L facility site, we ask that people try not to come during normal work hours. So if you are going to come and get compost on a Monday, just try and do it after 5 o'clock when most of the employees have already driven off the site, so that nobody's running into other vehicles and getting injured. And if you have any other questions about going to the site or where the compost is, you can email us at louisvillecompost@gmail.com or text Brian. He provided his information in the chat there. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we've been doing this. We're so grateful for Sean's initiative in getting this going out into the rest of the county. This is such a needed service, but we've been sitting there since late 2009. We've been available for people to bring their compostables, and we've been composting all this time. So we are delighted to have you show up anytime to bring your compostables. And if you have questions, I've been taking text messages and phone calls for 10 years. Come on, right? Whatever you got, we're happy to work it out. And of course, feel free to reach out to us through the co-op, but that's my phone number. Just reach out to me. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us.
Thanks, you guys. This was very interesting. I know we had a lot of questions. I'm sure there's a lot more questions. Now you have Brian's personal information, and I also stuck Louisville Compost Co-op, their Facebook page. They'll direct link to that in the chat box, so you can just scroll up and find that. We are at time. I feel like this totally flew by. I'm really appreciative of you guys being willing to speak on this. I know composting is something we always get asked about, so it'd be great to have you guys circle back and do another one in the coming months. The community is always really curious about it. So thank you all for being here. Any further questions, you can reach out to Sean and Brian after Green Drinks has ended. The last note for LSC here is, again, we just launched our community micro grant program. Check it out. I'm going to put that link in the chat box right now. Spread it with your networks, professional and personal. It's something we're really, really excited about to help fund some projects and initiatives throughout the city. So thank you everyone for being here, and we will see you next month, third Wednesday of every month from 6 to 7. So we're looking forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. And
Yes.
please reach out.
Thanks for being here, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Everyone
everyone.
take care. Be safe, stay warm.